And now we have Donald Trump revealing, I think, what's actually, in some ways, the impact of social media. The United States, I mean, there's like so many different responses, right, possible to Trump's tweeting that people of color should, quote, go back, to the countries that they came from, when in fact, with the exception of Ilhan Omar, they came from countries like Brooklyn. I mean, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's ancestry is Puerto Rican. It's particularly bizarre when you consider that 2 out of 3 Trump wives were not born in the United States. But he's not saying that white people should go back to the countries they came from. He's not suggesting that Melania should go back to the country she came from, or that her parents, who were recently naturalized, should go back to the country they came from, or that his son Barron, who is a first-generation descendant of an immigrant, his wife Melania, should go back to the country he came from. I mean, it's just, which is bizarre. So how does this come about? Well, in my opinion, America has always been essentially a racist country. We've had this melting pot story that we told ourselves, and we've really tried to embrace it in some ways over the years, and then sometimes we've really pulled back from that. In fact, most of the time we've kind of pulled back from it and really seen America more as an apartheid nation. Particularly, I mean, look at what we did with Native Americans. After slaughtering 50 to 100 million of them, we herded them into reservations and said, you stay there. And up until the 1950s, certainly with our public school system, actually until the 1960s, that's what we were doing with African Americans. And frankly, we're back to it. But until recently, the overt racism in the modern era, let's acknowledge, President Wilson, I think it was 1913, he did the first showing of Birth of a Nation in the White House. Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat. And Birth of a Nation was a recruiting film for the Klan. You can watch it online. It's pretty shocking that a president of the United States would preview this movie in the White House. So, we have this, these deep racist roots in this country. But at least since the 1950s or 60s, basically, in my lifetime and yours, however old you are, that was like, that's the past. And this is the present. We're trying to move forward, and we're trying to actually make America a great melting pot and fulfill the ideal that is, on the base of the Statue of Liberty. Send me your huddled masses. You're tired. You're poor. Yearning to breathe free. And we didn't basically discuss in polite company, and I put that in quotes, our racism. I'm not talking about so much our personal racism, although that wasn't discussed in polite company either, but even the conversation about racism in the United States. But what's happened now, and I think that social media has a lot to do with this, is that it has created a kind of hive mind. Now, there's actually a history to this. I mean, if you go back before Gutenberg and the printing press, there was very little kind of national consensus anywhere about anything. And then books started getting published, and so people started sharing ideas with each other, and the hive mind started forming beyond just local clans and communities and tribes and families and things like that. And then the newspaper, that was in as I recall, 1500s, 1560, I think it was, Gutenberg. And then, about 100 years later, printing press technology got pretty good, maybe 150 years later, and we started having newspapers, and that expanded the hive mind. So everybody in the city could read, what the thought leaders said. And then in the 1920s, we got radio, and that expanded the hive mind. And then in the 1950s, we got television, and that expanded the hive mind. But it was always done in a way that had a certain patina glaze over the top of it of respectability and of, looking down on racism as kind of lower class, as just, you don't talk about that in polite company, as I said earlier. But what has happened with the hive mind that has been created by social media is that immediately all this stuff, particularly social media that allows anonymity, is that social media now has brought out the racists, put them front and center. And you add to that the algorithms that social media uses and search engines use to feed you more of what you yourself have said. And so the racist who says something racist suddenly discovers that he's got, 1,000 other racists who are good buddies. And they start talking with each other and hanging out with each other, and it gets more and more open. And pretty soon you've got, the phenomena of these various white nationalist, white supremacist groups out marching in the streets. And I think, frankly, that it makes it look like the racism that is out there is actually bigger than it is, or maybe it is this big. But my concern is that by amplifying it this way, having social media amplify these kinds of sentiments, particularly coming from anonymous people, that causes the unconverted, that is, the people who are sitting around going, who have never really considered themselves racists or non-racists. And by the way, this doesn't just apply to racism. This applies to homophobia and the whole anti-LGBT perspective. I think homophobia is still an umbrella word that encompasses all of that. It applies to religious bigotry. It applies to just the nativism. I mean, this whole spectrum of stuff, right? Misogyny, and the whole spectrum of bigots. It provides them with this platform for hate speech that grows. And so Trump steps into this space and says, look at this, I got 50 million followers. And he looks at that and realizes that he can make flat out racist statements. Go back to where you came from. Most black people, most Hispanic people in the United States, most Asian people in the United States report, and there's now some actually good reporting coming out about this. There have been several of them just in the last 24 hours. ProPublica just did a fascinating one. In fact, they did a long tweet about it, and I retweeted it saying this thread is really worth reading. Finding that it's a very, very common experience among people of color, right across the spectrum, Asian, Hispanic, African American, to be told by white people, go back to where you came from, or go back to Africa, or go back to Mexico, or go back to China or whatever, and it's kids in school. I mean, it's thrown around as a slur. So when Trump said this, he knew exactly what he was saying. He's been talking like this, obviously, ever since his father was refusing to rent housing to African Americans, or broadly to people of color, in the Queens or Bronx or Brooklyn or wherever he came from. I guess it was the whatever. And here we are. And now Trump is saying today that the women of color that he trashed, saying that they should go back to the S-hole countries they came from, now he is tweeting this morning that they are the racists. Right? So not only is he making it okay for racist speech, but I mentioned the unconverted before. When he starts talking about countries run by people of color not working or being dysfunctional, I mean, I think most people understand that there are reasons why that is so often the case, and those reasons have to do with colonialism and racism. Not, any bell curve stuff about inherent inferiority or superiority. But for somebody who's not well informed, for your typical junior high school kid or your typical, low information voter, this stuff starts having an impact. And they start hearing this kind of rhetoric that Trump is using and thinking, maybe there's something to this. And pretty soon they're out there on the streets chanting, "Go home," to people whose ancestors probably came to the United States unwillingly in slave ships, 200 years before their own ancestors. The white people saying "Go homes." I mean, Trump is only, his grandfather came to this country in the late 1800s to start a brothel up on the West Coast. So this is how this is happening. Edmund Burke is often quoted as saying that all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men, was the phrase he used back then, to do nothing. And, where is, Mitt Romney's cousin, who, Ronna Romney McDaniel, who runs the Republican National Committee, the head of the RNC, she has not said a word. Where are the members of the Republican Party? None of them have said a word. The closest anybody got was, one senator on Sunday TV saying, well, Trump should really aim higher. Right? Good old Lindsey Graham. But that was it. He was one senator. I mean, this is just like the Republicans are completely mute about this. And I don't think it's because they're embarrassed. I think it's because they think that this is an electoral strategy that might win. And it might win big majorities for them in the House and the Senate as well as the White House. I really think that they're starting to buy into this belief that Trump has, that to hell with the middle, don't need the middle. The middle is, as Jim Hightower said, the only thing in the middle of the road are dead armadillos and yellow stripes. To hell with the middle. The base, about half of all Republican and Democratic base voters don't vote. So if you can get your base out, you can win elections.